30,000 people had lined the roads to watch this momentous event. And it's important to note that David in the preparations kind of cut a few corners. If you look at the parallel text in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, it says David conferred with his officers on how best to transport the ark. In every other major decision of David's life, he had consulted with God. Had he would have found that clearly the transportation rules were written out well, laid out well in the law of Moses. It was to be transported on poles that rested on the shoulders of Levitical priests, and they were the only ones to touch the sacred ark. Maybe the boys got to reasoning. We've got to get this job done. Let's ignore those out-of-date instructions from Moses. That was then, and this is now. Poles are so 2000 BC-ish. We're living in the modern times of 1000 BC. And the new technology marvel is the ox cart. God zapped Uzzah, according to the NKT. That's the New Curt translation for 2 Samuel chapter 6-7. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Now, I can hear your objections all the way up here. Uzzah only did what any of us would do. The ark was teetering and it was kind of tottering, and he didn't want the proverbial flag to touch the ground, so he reached out to steady it. But you have to remember, we are ascending up Route 66 into Zion, and there would have been no problem if they had been carrying the ark with Levitical priests as instructed. But they were treating the Almighty God of the universe as if he were a god in a box, and that he wasn't really at the ceremony that was in his honor. They ignored his laws. They mouthed some cliches. And they acted as if God couldn't keep his own presence from falling off the cart. Uzzah rushed forward like I once saw someone at a wedding to save a wedding cake as it was falling. But Uzzah died. Got to think, and read one time someplace, someone said churches ought to have special zoning that requires us to put signs all around. Beware of God. Now you think about it, just work with me this morning a little bit. In a sense, we maybe should do that, is to go up and down the streets around here telling people you'd be better off living next to a nuclear power plant than this church. Did I say that right? A nuclear power plant than living next to this church. The infinite, holy, majestic, powerful God. He will not be trifled with. Accordingly, there ought to be the slightest edge of fear in our worship times together. Eugene Peterson probably said it best, the translator of the Message. When we come into worship, he wrote, we ought to have the same feeling that people have when they're about to run with the bulls in Pamplona. We should have about the same feeling that those who surf the 40-foot waves off the coast of Hawaii. He goes on to say, we sinners must be a bit out of our minds to do such a reckless and crazy and unbelievable thing as to come into the very presence of a holy God. Now, personally, I believe Uzzah is in heaven. He's up there, still embarrassed, saying, what was I thinking? One day, while attending Denver's Bear Valley School of Biblical Studies, I toured a Jewish synagogue with my classmates. At one point during the study tour, the rabbi showed us their Torah, their Mishnah, and their Talmud, their sacred writings. And above was something written in Hebrew. We asked the rabbi, what's the meaning? He said, it states, remember before whom you stand. Uzzah should have read the sign. Church, we should read the sign. We should consider before whom we stand before entering into this very building or any place for worship. Now, this church does something that most churches do not. We prepare you well if you choose to do so for worship. How many of you rode the metro this morning? How many of you rode the metro? Okay. You are best prepared for worship over any of the others. More of you should take charge of that ministry. Yes, we need writers, but we also need drivers. You'll be prepared for worship. I mean, think about how it prepares you. You're on a train, oftentimes during high ridership times, where there's no chance to stand anywhere. But yet you pull up to a platform, no one offloads, everyone wants to get home, and what do? You begin scrunching and sucking in, and you begin to ask, am I small yet? We need to ask the same question when we come for worship. Am I small yet? Remember before whom you stand. Well, because of Uzzah's death, David cuts off the procession. Everybody goes home. They go back to the drawing board. 3 months later, they decide to take this up. But this time, the ark of God is on the poles and on the shoulders of the Levitical priests. And in verse 15, we find that famous passage, and David danced before the Lord with all of his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the God with shouts and sounds of trumpets. David had, I think, a gift for kind of being able to be caught up in the moment. And with his dream coming true, he strips off his robe and he comes to his underclothing and he leaps and he whirls and he spins and he dances in a way that just electrifies his nation. David shows us in this passage what worship is really like. C.S. Lewis said, in the presence of God, you feel one of two ways. One of two ways in His presence. He said, you either feel like a dirty little object, or like you're just going to lose yourself and forget about yourself in the things of worship. Do you recall the character Tivia from the 1964 Broadway play and the 1971 Academy Award-winning motion picture, Fiddler on the Roof? Do you recall how Tivia danced with that joyous shuffle and that heavenward glance? That's what I picture when I read about David dancing. Tivia, the father of that Russian Jewish family, he loses himself like David in song and in dance. My favorite, If I Were a Rich Man. If I were a rich man, come on, oh, I practiced all week. Aren't you just simply drawn into Tivia's happiness and that genuine love for himself as he kind of loses himself in an all-body expression to the God who has given him life and has given him challenges? And that's what we're doing here this morning. We're losing ourselves in marvel and in praise and in awe of the God of the universe. Now, the reason that we worship, why it's the most important thing we do, is because worship is our response to the self-revelation of God. You're here this morning, I bet, because at some time during your life, God revealed Himself to you. Maybe recently, maybe decades, could be longer. You're here this morning because of that. So you've come for an hour or more, during which time God is going to further reveal a bit of Himself to you. The word worship, I'm told, comes from the Middle English word shape, worth shape. You're here shaping your response to a loving God. Shaping your response.